They came with money in their hands. They came with ownership in their eyes. But every single one of them walked away empty-handed. At the edge of a southern slave market stood a young black girl, healthy, quiet, and unclaimed. Days passed. Buyers whispered. Auctioneers grew frustrated. And one question echoed again and again, a question so disturbing that it stopped every sale cold. Tonight, you will learn the true story of the slave girl who was never sold, because every buyer asked the same question. Before we go any further into this story, before we return fully to the dust, the chains, and the whispers, take a moment to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss stories history tried to erase, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affects you as it unfolds, because this is not just a story meant to be heard, it is a story meant to be remembered. Now, let us continue. The sun rose slowly over the Mississippi River, casting a pale orange glow across the wooden docks and dirt roads of the town. Morning mist clung to the air, heavy and damp, as wagons creaked toward the square. Men arrived early, some with ledgers tucked beneath their arms, others with coins sewn into the lining of their coats. They spoke casually, laughed, even, for them, this was business. The slave market was already awake. Iron chains scraped against planks. Boots struck the ground in uneven rhythms. Somewhere a child cried, softly at first, then louder, until a sharp command cut the sound short. The smell of sweat, tobacco, and fear blended into something almost tangible, like a fog that never lifted. This was where lives were reduced to numbers, and at the edge of the market, slightly apart from the others, stood a girl named Eliza. She did not call attention to herself. She did not resist. She did not weep. She stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes lowered, not in submission but in calculation. Eliza was young but not fragile. Around 16, maybe 17. Her skin bore no fresh scars. Her hands were rough enough to show she had worked, but not so broken that they frightened buyers away. Her posture suggested discipline. Her face, quiet, unreadable, made it difficult for anyone to guess what she was thinking. To the auctioneer she looked like profit. To the buyers she looked like possibility. Yet something about her unsettled them. She had been placed near the front of the stalls, positioned where the morning light would strike her face just right. The auctioneer knew what he was doing. Presentation mattered. A strong young girl could fetch a high price if sold early, before hesitation crept into the crowd. But as men approached, something strange happened. They slowed down. They looked longer. And instead of bidding, they asked questions. Eliza had been moved from the plantation only 2 days earlier. She remembered the moment clearly. The overseer's voice, sharp, impatient, calling her name. The sudden command to wash, to braid her hair neatly, to change into a clean dress, usually reserved for Sundays. She knew what it meant. Everyone did. Being sent to market was never a mystery. It was a sentence handed down without explanation, a decision made in rooms enslaved people were never allowed to enter. Sometimes it meant separation from family. Sometimes it meant relocation to harsher labor. Sometimes it meant never being seen again. Eliza did not ask why. Asking questions had never saved anyone. The wagon ride to town had been long and silent. Iron restraints bit into her wrists, though not tightly enough to bruise. Her master wanted her unmarked. Buyers preferred their property without visible damage. On the ride, Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She counted each turn, each bridge, each mile. Not because it would help her escape, but because attention to detail was one of the few freedoms she had left. Memory was something no one could sell. Now, standing at the market, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her body. Men examined her the way farmers examined horses. One touched her arm, squeezing slightly to test muscle. Another tilted her chin upward, forcing her to meet his gaze. A third circled her slowly, noting her height, her stance, her silence. She said nothing. Silence was safer. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began his pitch. Strong girl, house-trained, healthy, no known illness. The words rolled easily off his tongue. He had said them hundreds of times before, but then someone interrupted. A man in a dark coat stepped closer. His voice was low, almost polite. Has she been owned before? The auctioneer hesitated just for a moment. Yes, he said carefully, but not sold. That answer caused a pause. Another man leaned in. What kind of work did she do? House duties, some sewing, some reading. That raised eyebrows. House slaves were valuable, but they came with rumors, and rumors made men uneasy. A third buyer asked what everyone else was already thinking. Has she been used? The market grew quieter, not silent, but quieter in the way rooms grow quiet when something uncomfortable has been spoken aloud. Eliza stared at the ground. She had heard this question before. She had learned long ago what it meant. Buyers were not afraid of her past because they cared about her suffering. They were afraid because of what they believed that suffering might produce. A girl who had been abused was considered unpredictable. She might resist orders, she might refuse intimacy, she might break. To the men in that square, her trauma was not a tragedy, it was a liability. The auctioneer cleared his throat again. There's no evidence of... he began. But the man waved him off. I asked a simple question. The auctioneer's silence answered it, and one by one buyers stepped back. Not far, just enough to say, not her. Eliza noticed the shift immediately. She had learned to read rooms before she ever learned to read words, the slight tightening of jaws, the way men avoided eye contact with the auctioneer now, the way interest turned into caution. This was not her first time being looked at like this. On the plantation, she had learned which doors were safe to stand near, and which ones to avoid entirely. She had learned which footsteps in the hallway meant she should disappear into the shadows. She had learned that attention was dangerous, and now, for the first time, attention was fading, not because she was undesirable, but because she was too known. Hours passed. Other enslaved people were sold. A man was taken to the fields upriver. A woman and her child were sold together, rare but not unheard of. Another child was pulled screaming from his mother's arms. Eliza watched all of it. She did not cry. Crying drew attention, and attention had always been the enemy. The auctioneer tried again. He raised his voice, changed his tone, spoke faster. Strong girl, excellent condition, educated enough to follow orders properly. But each time a buyer stepped forward, the same question returned, and each time the answer remained trapped in silence. What no one in that market realized was that Eliza understood exactly why this was happening. She had never been officially sold because she had been kept too close to the house, too close to the master's quarters, too close to secrets that were never written down. She knew the price of that closeness. She also knew what it did to a man's reputation, and reputation mattered more than truth. By late afternoon, the sun burned high and unforgiving. Sweat soaked into collars and sleeves. The market thinned as buyers made their purchases and left. Eliza was still there, unsold, unclaimed. The auctioneer avoided looking at her now. Each failed attempt cost him standing, cost him money, cost him control. To him, she was no longer a promising asset, she was a problem. But to Eliza, something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. Not hope, not freedom, but time. Time she had never been given before. Time where no one touched her. Time where no one claimed ownership. Time where the worst question imaginable became her unintended shield. She remained still, and the market moved around her. By the time the shadows began to stretch across the market square, Eliza understood something that no one had explained to her, but which her body already knew. She was not being ignored. She was being studied. The market had not rejected her outright. Instead, it circled her slowly, cautiously, like a predator uncertain whether its prey might bite back. Men passed her stall again and again. Some pretended to look at others while stealing glances in her direction. Others stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking toward her face and then away again, as if holding her gaze for too long might expose something they were afraid to name. The auctioneer shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His voice had grown hoarse from calling prices, praising bodies, masking cruelty with commerce. Each sale brought him relief. Each unsold moment with Eliza brought irritation. He cleared his throat and called out again, "Next lot still available, young girl, good condition, obedient." A buyer stepped forward, interrupting him with a raised hand. This one was older. His hair was grey at the temples. He wore a coat that had seen years of use, not new money but steady money, the kind of man who prided himself on knowing the market better than anyone else. He looked at Eliza for a long time, not hungrily, not eagerly, but carefully. Then he asked it, the same question, quiet enough that only those closest could hear, but loud enough to shift the air around them. "Has she been touched?" The auctioneer stiffened. This time he tried a different approach. "She's never been sold," he said quickly. "Still young, no record of—" The man held up a finger. "I didn't ask about records," he said. "I asked about truth." The space between them grew tense. The auctioneer looked past the man, scanning the crowd, searching for support. None came. Every other buyer was listening now. Every other buyer wanted the answer, but none of them wanted to be the one to ask again, because asking meant acknowledging what everyone already suspected. Eliza's eyes remained lowered, but she heard every word. She always did. This question, the one that followed her like a shadow, was not new. She had first heard it years earlier, whispered between overseers, when they thought she was too young to understand. She had heard it murmured by visiting men, spoken as though she were furniture that had already been worn thin. At first she hadn't known what it meant, only that it made people uncomfortable, only that it made adults quiet when she entered the room, only that it changed the way men looked at her, from curiosity to calculation. Now, standing in the open air of the market, the meaning of the question was unavoidable, and worse, it was profitable. In the slave economy, bodies were investments. Strength meant labor, youth meant longevity, fertility meant expansion, but purity, whatever that word meant in such a system, was currency of a different kind. A girl believed to be untouched was seen as controllable, moldable, easier to break. A girl believed to have already been violated carried something buyers could not measure, could not insure against, could not erase. They feared resistance born from suffering. They feared silence that hid rage. They feared eyes that had already seen too much, and Eliza's eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, terrified them. The auctioneer swallowed. "There's no proof of any misconduct," he said finally. "She was kept in the house for training." That was a mistake. The older buyer's expression hardened. "Kept I?" "The house," he repeated slowly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. House slaves were not uncommon, but they were always suspect, too close to power, too exposed to desire, too likely to know things no one wanted repeated. The buyer took a step back. "I won't bid," he said, not without certainty. He turned and walked away, just like that. No argument, no drama, no bid. Eliza felt something loosen inside her chest, not relief, recognition. As the afternoon wore on, the pattern repeated itself. Different men, same approach, same question. Some asked directly, some hinted, some waited for others to ask and listened carefully to what wasn't said, and every time the silence that followed became heavier. It wasn't just that the auctioneer wouldn't answer, it was that he couldn't, because there were no papers for what had happened in the house, no ledger entries, no transactions recorded, only memory, only rumor, only the unspoken understanding that certain things never needed to be written down. Eliza remembered the house. She remembered how different it felt from the fields, quieter, cleaner, more dangerous. In the fields, violence was loud, visible, expected. In the house, it was careful, measured, wrapped in politeness. She had learned early that pain delivered softly lasted longer. She had learned when to lower her eyes and when to raise them just enough to appear obedient. She had learned how to move without making sound, how to breathe shallowly, how to disappear in plain sight. Those lessons were etched into her posture now, and the buyers could see them. They might not have known exactly what she had endured, but they recognized the signs of someone who had learned survival too well. By mid-afternoon, frustration replaced curiosity. The auctioneer snapped at a boy who wandered too close. He wiped sweat from his brow and cursed under his breath. Each unsold hour cost him commission. Each unanswered question cost him credibility. He tried to regain control. "Enough of this," he barked. "You're buying labor, not stories." A younger man laughed nervously. "Stories have consequences," he replied. The auctioneer glared at Eliza as if she were responsible, and in a way she was. Without speaking a word, without lifting her head, without doing anything at all, her existence was disrupting the transaction. What made it worse, for them, was that she looked fine, too fine, no bruises, no limp, no visible signs of damage. If she had been visibly broken, they could have rationalized it. If she had been defiant, they could have punished it. But she stood there calm, composed, contained. That kind of restraint suggested history, and history made men uneasy. As the sun dipped lower, a final buyer approached. This one was different, younger than most. Well-dressed, clean boots, soft hands, a first-time buyer. He stood awkwardly, unsure where to look. "I need someone for my wife," he said quietly. "Housework, cooking." The auctioneer seized the opportunity. "She's perfect for that," he said quickly. "Educated, quiet, obedient." The young man nodded, then hesitated. He lowered his voice. I just need to know one thing." The auctioneer closed his eyes. "Ask," he said. The young man swallowed. "Has she been harmed?" The word hung in the air. Harmed, not used, not touched, harmed. It was the closest anyone had come to truth all day. The auctioneer opened his eyes and looked directly at Eliza. For a brief moment their gazes met. In that instant Eliza understood something crucial. He knew, and he was deciding whether telling the truth mattered. His mouth opened, then closed. "I can't say," he said finally. The young man nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, and he walked away. The market did not close officially until dusk, but Eliza was already alone. Other stalls stood empty. Chains lay coiled on the ground where bodies had stood only hours before. The sounds of bargaining faded, replaced by the low murmur of departure. Eliza remained, unsold, unclaimed. The auctioneer kicked a crate in frustration. "Damn it," he muttered. "Too much trouble." Trouble, that word followed her too. As guards prepared to pack up for the evening, Eliza was led to a holding area, a small fenced space behind the market. No chains this time, no urgency. She sat on a wooden bench and watched the sky darken. This was the first night in her life she had not belonged to someone new by sundown. The realization unsettled her. Belonging had always been immediate, decided by others. Final, now there was delay, and delay in a system built on certainty was dangerous. Eliza did not know what would happen next. She did not know if tomorrow would bring another attempt, another question, another silence. But she knew this. The same question that had haunted her in private rooms had followed her into public light. And for the first time, it had worked in her favor. Not because anyone cared, but because the truth, unspoken, unresolved, made ownership uncomfortable. As darkness settled over the town, Eliza closed her eyes. The market had stopped. The question had not, and neither had she. Night settled over the town slowly, not with peace, but with a heavy stillness that pressed against the skin. The market square, so loud and merciless during the day, now lay scattered with evidence of what had taken place there. Loose chains glinting faintly under lantern light, dark stains pressed into the dirt where feet had stood for hours, the lingering smell of sweat and fear clinging to the air long after the crowds had gone. Eliza sat on the wooden bench behind the holding fence, her back straight despite the ache that had crept into her shoulders. She listened to the distant sounds of taverns filling with laughter and drink, of men congratulating themselves on purchases made, of money changing hands as though nothing sacred had been violated. She remained where she was, unsold, unnamed in any ledger, suspended between ownerships in a way that should not have been possible, and yet here she was, breathing in borrowed time, while the system that had always consumed her struggled to decide what to do with her next. By morning, the reason for that struggle would become clearer, not just to Eliza, but to anyone who understood the unspoken logic that governed the buying and selling of human lives. The fear surrounding her was not personal, it was structural. She represented a contradiction that slavery could not easily resolve. Buyers did not fear her because she was weak or broken, but because she might not be. They feared the possibility that suffering had shaped her into something unpredictable, something that could not be reduced to obedience with simple violence. In their world, pain was supposed to simplify a person, strip them down until compliance remained. But Eliza's quiet, her restraint, her steady presence suggested that pain had instead sharpened her, given her an interior life that refused to reveal itself. And that interior life, invisible and immeasurable, was what frightened them most. The buyers who had asked the question throughout the day had not done so out of cruelty alone, though cruelty was woven into every part of the system. They asked because experience had taught them that certain people could not be owned easily once they had endured too much. There were stories whispered among plantation owners of enslaved women who refused intimacy even under threat, of men who followed orders but sabotaged work quietly, of girls who appeared obedient yet poisoned meals or fled at the first opportunity, carrying knowledge of the household that made them dangerous beyond their physical strength. Trauma, though never acknowledged as such, was recognized as a destabilizing force. It disrupted productivity, it complicated control, it turned investments into risks, and Eliza, with her calm P.O., sure and unreadable gaze, looked like someone who had learned to endure without surrendering herself entirely. As dawn approached, Eliza remained awake, her thoughts moving slowly, carefully, the way she had learned to move through rooms where every sound carried consequences. She understood that her unsold status was temporary. The system would not allow her to remain in this limbo forever. Something would be decided, and it would not be in her favor. Yet she also sensed that something had shifted, not in the world around her, but in how that world perceived her. She was no longer just a body to be used, she was a question without an answer. And questions, especially unanswered ones, made men uneasy. When the market reopened the following day, the tension returned almost immediately. Buyers arrived with fresh resolve, determined not to be unsettled by rumors or hesitation. Yet the moment Eliza was brought back into view, the same pause spread through the crowd. Conversations slowed, eyes narrowed. The previous day's failure had not been forgotten. If anything, it had grown larger in the telling, exaggerated by whispers exchanged over drinks the night before. Some said she was cursed. Others said she had driven a master mad. A few claimed she knew how to read minds, that she looked at men as though she could see their intentions before they acted on them. None of these stories were true, but truth had never mattered much in the slave market. Perception was enough. What the buyers truly feared was not Eliza herself, but what she represented, a person whose suffering could not be neatly compartmentalized or exploited. In their calculations, a slave's value depended on predictability. Strength could be measured, skills could be taught, even resistance could be punished into submission. But emotional damage, though never named as such, was understood to be volatile. A girl who had been harmed might comply outwardly while resisting inwardly, withholding something essential that no amount of force could extract. She might survive where others broke, and in surviving, retain a sense of self that ownership was supposed to erase. That kind of survival was dangerous, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. Eliza felt the weight of these fears without hearing them spoken. She sensed the hesitation in the way buyers approached her, the caution in their steps, the way their questions circled around her without ever quite landing. She had learned long ago that people often revealed their deepest anxieties through what they refused to say outright. In the plantation house, silence had been her shield. Now, in the open market, that same silence was being interpreted as something else entirely. It marked her as someone with a past too complicated to be profitable. The auctioneer, growing increasingly desperate, attempted to counter these perceptions by emphasizing her obedience, her training, her apparent calm. Yet each reassurance only deepened the suspicion. Obedience that came without visible fear was unsettling. Calm that survived scrutiny suggested experience, and experience in this context was a liability. The buyers wanted blank slates, not individuals shaped by suffering. They wanted bodies that could be inscribed with their will, not minds that might resist silently. Eliza, whether she intended to or not, embodied resistance simply by existing as she was. As the day progressed, the market's attention shifted subtly away from her, not because interest had vanished, but because uncertainty had grown too heavy. Buyers who might have taken a chance under different circumstances chose safer options instead. Younger children, easier to mold, men whose labor potential outweighed concerns about emotional complexity, women whose histories were unknown or conveniently ignored. Eliza remained where she was, a constant presence that disrupted the flow of transactions without actively participating in them. Her unsold status, became a quiet statement, a reminder that the system, for all its brutality, had limits it did not like to confront. Eliza herself did not celebrate this moment. She had survived long enough to know that reprieve was not the same as escape. Yet she could not ignore the strange sense of power that came from being the one thing the market could not easily process. For years, she had been shaped by other people's desires, fears, and control. Now, those same forces were colliding with each other, creating a space she occupied without permission. She was not free, but she was momentarily unowned, and that distinction mattered more than anyone around her realized. The buyer's fear of her was rooted in a deeper fear of what slavery did to people beyond the physical. They did not want to acknowledge that cruelty could produce resilience, that suffering could sharpen awareness rather than dull it. To admit that would be to admit that the system they relied on was flawed, that it could not fully control the human spirit, no matter how violently it tried. Eliza stood as living evidence of that possibility, and evidence once seen could not be unseen. As afternoon faded into evening again, the market grew restless. The auctioneer's frustration was palpable, his voice sharper, his patience thinner. He understood, on some level, that Eliza was becoming a liability not just because she was unsold, but because she was influencing the behavior of others. Her presence altered the atmosphere, introducing hesitation where decisiveness was required. She was, without intending to be. She took, as she stood again at the edge of the market, her presence quiet, but impossible to ignore. Men often mistook silence for emptiness. They believed that if a person did not speak, did not protest, did not cry out, then there must be nothing inside worth listening to. Eliza knew better. Silence was not absence, it was containment. It was a way of holding oneself together when the world demanded pieces. In the plantation house, she had learned to store her thoughts behind her eyes, to fold her fear inward, to let her stillness become a barrier no one thought to challenge. Now, under the open sky of the market, that same stillness unsettled buyers who were accustomed to seeing fear plainly displayed. They wanted trembling hands, darting eyes, visible submission. Eliza offered none of it. Her posture remained steady, her gaze lowered but not vacant, her hands relaxed at her sides rather than clenched in desperation. To the auctioneer, this made her appear manageable. To the buyers, it suggested calculation. They wondered what kind of girl could stand so quietly in a place designed to strip people of dignity and still appear whole. They wondered what she was thinking. They wondered if she was thinking at all. And in that wondering, doubt grew. Eliza did not consciously decide to use her silence as a weapon. It had become instinct long before she understood its power. In the house, silence had been survival. It had allowed her to pass through rooms without drawing attention, to endure moments that could not be resisted openly. Over time, she learned that silence unsettled those who expected reaction. It denied them confirmation. It forced them to confront their own assumptions. In the market, this effect multiplied. Each unanswered question echoed louder than any spoken response could have. The buyers spoke among themselves, attempting to define her through speculation. Some claimed she was dull, her quietness a sign of submission. Others suspected the opposite, that she was sharp, observant, and hiding it. Both interpretations worked against her sale. A submissive girl who had been harmed was considered damaged. A perceptive girl who had been harmed was considered dangerous. There was no version of her silence that fit neatly into the logic of the market, and because it could not be categorized, it could not be priced. Eliza felt the weight of their interpretations without internalizing them. She had spent years learning to separate how others saw her from who she was. In the plantation house, she had watched masters project their fears, desires, and guilt onto enslaved bodies, mistaking projection for truth. She understood that what the buyers saw in her now was not her reality, but their own unease reflected back at them. That understanding gave her a strange sense of distance, as though she were observing the market rather than being consumed by it. The master who had brought her there watched this unfolding with growing anger. To him, Eliza's silence was not strategic or symbolic, it was insubordination. He had expected the market to absorb her quickly, to turn her into profit and erase whatever complications she represented. Instead, she had become a mirror held up to his reputation, reflecting rumors he had never bothered to silence because he had never imagined they would cost him money. Each buyer's hesitation felt like an accusation. Each unanswered question felt like exposure. He approached her late in the afternoon, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Eliza sensed him before she saw him, the familiar tension tightening in her chest. She did not look up. She knew better. He stood too close, close enough that she could smell tobacco and sweat, close enough that his shadow fell across her hands. "Why don't you say something?" he hissed under his breath, careful not to draw attention. "You want to stand here forever?" Eliza remained silent. Her refusal to respond was not defiance in the way he understood. "Do it." It was not a challenge. It was not rebellion. It was simply the absence of cooperation, and that absence infuriated him more than open resistance ever had. He could punish words, he could punish actions, but silence left him with nothing to strike except his own frustration. To the master, Eliza's stillness felt like mockery. He had owned her body, controlled her movements, dictated her days, yet here she stood, undermining him without lifting a finger. He could not accuse her of misbehavior without revealing why buyers hesitated. He could not force her to speak without drawing attention. He was trapped by the same unspoken truths that trapped the market. Eliza felt his anger but did not absorb it. She had learned that anger, like fear, could be endured if it was not acknowledged. She focused instead on the rhythm of the day, the way the sun shifted across the ground, the way voices rose and fell. She anchored herself in the present moment, a habit she had developed during long hours in the house when time seemed to stretch endlessly. Anchoring kept her from breaking. Anchoring kept her intact. As the day wore on, it became clear that her silence was changing the behavior of those around her. Buyers approached more cautiously, asked fewer questions aloud, relied instead on glances and gestures. The market grew quieter, its usual chaos muted by collective discomfort. Eliza was not the loudest presence there, but she was the heaviest. Her quiet seemed to absorb sound, to slow movement, to demand consideration in a place designed to discourage it. This was not power in any conventional sense. Eliza could not command attention or shape outcomes directly, yet her presence exerted influence simply by existing outside expectation. She did not perform suffering for the buyers. She did not plead for mercy. She did not reassure them of her compliance. In refusing to perform, she disrupted the transaction. She forced them to confront the reality that the system required performance as much as force, that obedience had to be visible to be believable. Eliza understood, perhaps without naming it, that her silence denied the buyers a story they could use to justify ownership. They wanted narratives that absolved them, that framed their actions as necessary or benign. A silent girl offered no such narrative. She did not confirm their assumptions. She did not contradict them either. She simply stood, a living question mark, and let their discomfort speak for itself. As evening approached again, the market's patience wore thin. The auctioneer avoided her entirely now, focusing on easier sales. Guards lingered nearby, uncertain whether she required closer watch or none at all. Eliza remained in her place, her body tired but her mind steady. She had learned long ago that endurance was not passive. It was active, deliberate, sustained. It required constant adjustment, constant awareness. It required choosing again and again not to give more than was taken. Her silence was not empty. It was full of memory, of knowledge, of boundaries drawn invisibly but firmly. It was the sum of everything she had learned about surviving in a world that demanded her erasure. And as the market slowed and the day drew to a close, it became clear that this silence had done something remarkable. It had turned her from an object to be consumed into a problem to be solved. The master watched her from a distance, his jaw clenched, his authority undermined by a girl who refused to speak. He understood now that the market would not resolve this on its own. Something would have to change. Either Eliza would be removed or her silence would be broken. The system could tolerate many forms of cruelty, but it could not tolerate ambiguity for long. Eliza sensed this approaching shift with the same quiet awareness that had guided her through countless dangers. She did not know what form it would take, but she knew that her stillness had forced a response. Whether that response would bring punishment or opportunity remained uncertain. But for the moment, as the light faded and the market quieted once more, Eliza remained where she was, silent and unyielding, her very presence a reminder that even within the most brutal systems, there were ways to resist that left no marks and required no words. By the time the next morning came, the master had already made his decision, though he would not have named it that way. To him, it felt less like a choice and more like a necessity forced upon him by circumstances he refused to acknowledge as his own making. The market had failed him, and failure was intolerable. In a world where power depended on certainty, uncertainty was an insult. Eliza's continued presence, silent and unsold, had begun to erode his authority not just in the eyes of buyers, but in his own. Each hour she remained, there was another hour in which whispers grew louder, another hour in which men wondered what kind of owner could not move his own property. That question gnawed at him more fiercely than any concern for profit. He arrived early, before most buyers had gathered, his boots striking the ground with purpose. Eliza was already there, standing where she had stood the day before, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. To him, this constancy felt deliberate, as though she were daring the world to move around her again. He did not greet her. He did not look at her for long. Instead, he spoke quietly to the auctioneer, his voice tight with irritation, his words clipped and precise. He wanted this resolved. He wanted her gone. How that happened mattered less than the fact that it happened soon. The auctioneer listened, nodding slowly, his own discomfort evident. He understood the risk of keeping Eliza visible for another day. The market thrived on momentum, on the quick turnover of bodies and money. A stalled sale threatened that rhythm. Yet he also understood that forcing a sale could create its own problems. A buyer who felt deceived might retaliate. Reputation mattered even in this brutal economy. The two men stood together, united by self-interest, and considered their options while Eliza waited within sight, but just beyond their conversation, her presence an unspoken pressure. When the buyers arrived, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The previous day's hesitation lingered, thicker now, reinforced by repetition. Men glanced toward Eliza, then quickly away, as though afraid of being drawn into the same uncertainty that had trapped others. The master watched this with barely contained fury. He had brought her here to be consumed by the market, not to haunt it. Each avoided glance felt like a personal affront. Determined to reassert control, he stepped forward himself, positioning his body close enough to Eliza that his authority was unmistakable. His voice rose, carrying across the square with practiced ease. He spoke of her strength, her obedience, her usefulness. He framed her silence as docility, her stillness as proof of good training. He did not mention the house. He did not invite questions. His performance was meant to overwhelm doubt with confidence. For a moment it seemed to work. A few buyers paused, listening. One stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he assessed Eliza anew. The master felt a flicker of satisfaction. Control, he told himself, could be reclaimed if applied forcefully enough. Yet even as he spoke, the old tension crept back in. Confidence could not erase what had already been sensed. The buyer's eyes drifted again, their curiosity tempered by caution. And then, inevitably, the question resurfaced, not shouted but murmured, passed from one man to another until it reached the front once more. The master felt it like a blow. His jaw tightened. He forced a smile that did not reach his eyes and answered before the auctioneer could intervene. He dismissed the concern with practiced disdain, insisting there was nothing to discuss, nothing to fear. His tone was sharp enough to warn against further inquiry. Silence followed, but it was not the silence he wanted. It was heavy with skepticism. The buyers had heard confidence before. What they had not heard was reassurance. Eliza stood through this exchange without reacting, her face calm, her eyes lowered. Inside, she felt the familiar tightening that came when the master grew agitated. She knew the signs, the way his voice changed when control slipped from his grasp. She did not anticipate mercy. She did not expect fairness. She simply observed, noting how his desperation revealed itself in small ways, in the rigidity of his posture, in the way his hands curled and uncurling at his sides. She understood something he did not, that the harder he pushed, the more visible the cracks became. As the morning wore on, it became clear that his intervention had only sharpened the market's unease. Buyers who might have approached cautiously now stayed back entirely. The master's presence, intended to reassure, had instead drawn attention to the very power imbalance they feared. He looked too invested, too eager to sell. That eagerness suggested urgency, and urgency suggested a problem. Eliza, once again, remained unsold. Frustration gave way to anger. The master pulled her aside, away from the stalls, his grip tight on her arm. He hissed at her, accusing her of sabotage, of willful defiance. He demanded that she speak, that she reassure the buyers, that she perform obedience more convincingly. Eliza did not respond. She did not pull away. She simply endured, her silence absorbing his accusations without reflecting them back. This only enraged him further. He threatened punishment, promised consequences once they returned to the plantation. His words spilled out, sharp and unchecked, revealing more than he intended. Those closest could not help but notice. A guard shifted uncomfortably. The auctioneer looked away. The spectacle of a master berating his own property in public unsettled even those accustomed to cruelty. It confirmed what many already suspected, that Eliza was not merely unsold by chance, but because something about her history made control difficult. The master, in his attempt to reclaim authority, had exposed his vulnerability instead. Eventually he released her, stepping back as though he had been burned. Eliza returned to her place without comment, her composure intact. Inside, she felt a familiar ache of endurance, but also a growing clarity. The master's power depended on others believing in it. Each outburst weakened that belief. Each failed attempt to sell her diminished him. She did not take satisfaction in this realization. She simply recognized it as truth. By afternoon, the decision was made without ceremony. Eliza would not be sold that day. The auctioneer announced it casually, as though it were a minor logistical matter. The master's face darkened, but he did not argue. He had exhausted his options, and continuing to press the issue would only deepen the humiliation. Instead, he turned inward, his thoughts already moving toward retribution. Control, if it could not be exercised publicly, would be reclaimed privately. Eliza sensed this shift immediately. She knew what return to the plantation meant. She knew that the master's wounded pride would seek an outlet. Yet she also knew that something fundamental had changed. The market had seen her. The question had been asked too many times to be forgotten. Even if she were removed from public view, the doubt she had introduced would linger, attached to his name, his reputation. He could punish her body, but he could not fully erase what had been revealed. As they prepared to leave the market, Eliza glanced once at the square she had occupied for days. It looked ordinary now, emptied of its drama, already resetting for the next transaction. Yet she understood that her presence there had left a mark, subtle but real. The system had fault. Ered, if only briefly, confronted with something it could not easily absorb. That realization stayed with her as she was led away, her steps steady, her silence intact. The master walked ahead, his back rigid, his authority outwardly restored but inwardly shaken. He told himself that this episode would be corrected, that order would be re-established. Eliza followed without resistance, carrying with her the knowledge that desperation had revealed itself in him, and that once seen, it could not be unseen. The market had not broken her. Instead, it had exposed the limits of his control, setting in motion consequences neither of them could yet fully understand. Expand Part 6 in 2,000 words. Make sure that continue from the previous part in one flow. Give in the form of paragraph. The road away from the market was quieter than the days that had preceded it, the wagon wheels turning slowly as though even the horses sensed the weight of what had not happened. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, wrists unbound now but no less constrained by what waited ahead. The master rode ahead, his posture rigid, his silence sharp with unspoken fury. He did not look back at her. He did not need to. In his mind, the failure of the market was already being rewritten as a temporary inconvenience, something to be corrected once they returned to familiar ground, where authority did not have to be negotiated. Yet beneath that certainty lay unease, a thin fracture running through his confidence because the market had done something unexpected. It had reflected his own vulnerability back at him, and he had seen it. As the plantation came into view, Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. This place had shaped her in ways she could not fully articulate, teaching her when to speak and when to disappear, when to move and when to remain still. She understood that the master would attempt to reassert control here, away from the eyes of buyers and auctioneers, away from questions he could not answer publicly. Control, in private, could be enforced without explanation. The market had limits, the plantation did not. Yet even as she braced herself for what might come, Eliza carried something back with her that she had not brought with her when she left. She carried proof that the system, so absolute in appearance, could hesitate the first days after their return past in tense quiet. Eliza was set back into her routine, given tasks that kept her close to the house, watched more carefully than before. The master avoided direct confrontation, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He spoke to others in low tones, his words clipped, his irritation poorly concealed. Eliza noticed how his authority seemed strained, how servants who once deferred automatically now exchanged glances when he passed. It was subtle, but she had learned to read subtle shifts. The market's failure had followed him home, clinging to his reputation like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. Whispers began to circulate among the enslaved, carried quietly from room to room, from field to house. They spoke of the girl who had not sold, of the buyers who had asked the same question and walked away. The story changed with each telling, growing larger, more symbolic. Some said Eliza had cursed the market, others said she had stared buyers into silence. Eliza heard these whispers and understood that they were not about her as a person, but about possibility. Her unsold status had become a story that suggested something dangerous and hopeful at once, that the market's power was not absolute. The master sensed this shift as well. He responded with increased control, issuing sharper commands, punishing small infractions more harshly. Yet the harder he pushed, the more brittle his authority appeared. Fear could compel obedience, but it could not erase memory. The memory of the market lingered, a shared knowledge that something had gone wrong. The usual order had been disrupted. Eliza's presence, quiet and unyielding, served as a constant reminder of that disruption. Over time, a new dynamic emerged. The master began to distance himself from Eliza, assigning others to oversee her tasks, avoiding direct interaction. To be near her was to be reminded of his failure. To look at her was to recall the unanswered question that had cost him profit and pride. Eliza noticed this withdrawal and understood its significance. She had become inconvenient, not because she resisted openly, but because she embodied uncertainty. In a system that relied on clear hierarchies, uncertainty was corrosive. The plantation itself seemed to respond to this tension. Routine continued, but with an undercurrent of watchfulness. Overseers lingered longer than necessary. Conversations cut off abruptly when certain people approached. Eliza moved through these spaces with practiced care, her silence intact, her awareness sharpened. She did not seek attention. She did not avoid it either. She simply existed as she had learned to exist, contained and observant, letting others project their fears and assumptions onto her. What the master did not anticipate was how quickly the market's judgment would spread beyond that single square. Buyers talked. They always did. Names and reputations traveled along river routes and trade paths, carried by men who believed gossip to be as valuable as currency. Questions about Eliza became questions about him. What kind of owner produced a slave no one wanted to buy? What kind of house bred such complications? These questions were not asked to his face, but he felt their presence in subtle slights, in deals that fell through, in invitations that did not come. Eliza was largely shielded from these external consequences, but she sensed the shift in atmosphere. The master's world was shrinking, his authority contested in ways he could not easily confront. And in that shrinking, his focus turned inward. He sought to restore order by tightening control over the plantation itself, by reasserting dominance in the spaces he still commanded. For Eliza, this meant increased scrutiny, more rigid expectations, less tolerance for ambiguity. Yet even as pressure mounted, Eliza found that her silence continued to protect her in unexpected ways. The master, wary of drawing attention to her again, hesitated to punish her openly. To do so would be to acknowledge that she was a problem, and acknowledging that problem risked confirming the rumors he wished to suppress. She occupied a precarious position, neither favored nor condemned, watched closely but left largely untouched. It was not freedom, but it was a narrow margin of safety carved out by circumstance rather than design. Within that margin, Eliza learned to listen more closely than ever. She listened to the rhythms of the house, to the patterns of movement, to the tones of voices that signaled danger or opportunity. She listened to the stories whispered by others, piecing together how her unsold status had begun to alter perceptions beyond the plantation. The market had rejected her, but in doing so, it had also marked her as different, as someone who did not fit neatly into the expected roles. That difference, though dangerous, also carried a strange weight. It made people hesitate. The master, increasingly isolated by his own secrecy, failed to recognize how that hesitation undermined him. He believed control could be restored through force and silence, through erasing the memory of the market rather than addressing it. But memory had a way of persisting, especially when it was shared. The enslaved remembered, the buyers remembered. Even those who tried not to think about it felt its presence in the way conversations shifted when Eliza's name was mentioned. As months passed, the master faced a choice he could no longer postpone. Keeping Eliza served as a constant reminder of his failure. Selling her privately might still be possible, but the question would follow her, and with it, the risk of further embarrassment. Sending her away, perhaps to another region, might erase the immediate problem, but would require admitting defeat. Each option threatened his sense of control. Eliza sensed this crossroads long before it was spoken aloud. She felt it in the way the master watched her from a distance, his gaze calculating rather than angry. She understood that she was being weighed again, not in terms of value, but in terms of liability. The system was recalibrating, searching for a way to resolve the anomaly she represented. And anomalies, she knew, were rarely tolerated for long. Yet even as that realization settled in, Eliza remained grounded in the present. She focused on what she could control, her movements, her silence, her awareness. She had learned that survival did not always mean escape. Sometimes it meant endurance until circumstances shifted again. The market had shown her that shifts were possible even within the most rigid systems. That knowledge sustained her now, quiet and steady, as she waited to see how the system would respond to a problem it could not easily erase. The plantation continued its routines, but beneath them ran an undercurrent of tension that did not dissipate. Eliza moved through this environment like a still point in a turning world, her presence subtly altering the dynamics around her. She did not speak of the market. She did not need to. The market spoke through her, through the hesitation she inspired, through the questions that lingered unasked but unanswered. And as the master struggled to contain the consequences of that hesitation, it became clear that the system's attempt to reclaim control had only revealed its fragility. The market had turned against itself, and Eliza, without intending to, had become the fault line along which that turn had begun. The plantation moved through another season, and with it came the slow erosion of certainty that the master could neither name nor stop. Eliza's presence, once central to his household routines, became increasingly peripheral, as though distance itself might dull memory. She was reassigned again and again, shifted from task to task without explanation, always useful, never visible. This was not mercy, it was strategy. The master believed that if Eliza could be made small enough in daily life, the question that had followed her through the market would eventually lose its power. Yet what he did not understand was that erasure does not undo impact, it only deepens it. By attempting to make Eliza invisible, he confirmed to those around him that she mattered more than he wished to admit. Eliza felt this change keenly, though she did not resist it. She accepted the new routines with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else, understanding that survival often required cooperation without surrender. She was given work that kept her away from the main house, then later work that brought her back again, but only when no guests were present. Her movements were watched, but less harshly than before, as though the master feared provoking attention more than he feared her disobedience. This careful distance was its own form of admission. It told her that the power he wielded over her body did not extend as fully over the story attached to it. The enslaved community noticed these shifts, even when they were not spoken aloud. People noticed who was hidden and who was displayed, who was punished publicly, and who was corrected quietly. Eliza became a figure discussed in low voices, her unsold status transformed into a symbol that grew more layered with each retelling. Some said she had been spared by fate, others that she had frightened the market itself. None of these stories were entirely true, but they carried a shared understanding. Something about her had disrupted the expected order, and that disruption had consequences. In a world where most people were denied even the smallest form of agency, the idea that one person's presence could cause hesitation was powerful. Eliza did not encourage these stories, nor did she deny them. She understood that narrative could be as dangerous as it was protective. Attention, even admiring attention, carried risk. She moved carefully, maintaining the same reserve that had carried her through the market, the same inward focus that allowed her to endure. Yet she could not help noticing how others looked at her now, with curiosity rather than pity, with a kind of cautious respect. They did not see her as free, but they saw her as altered by something that had touched the system itself. The master's discomfort deepened as word spread beyond the plantation. Traders passing through asked questions he could not answer easily. Conversations shifted when his name was mentioned. Deals took longer to finalize. He began to sense that Eliza's story had escaped his control, traveling along the same informal networks that carried prices and rumors from town to town. This was not the kind of notoriety he wanted. In a system built on reputation, being associated with uncertainty was a liability. He responded as he always had when threatened, by tightening his grip, by attempting to manage perception through silence and intimidation. Eliza felt the weight of this response without becoming its focus. The master was careful now, aware that overt cruelty might confirm the worst assumptions. His anger manifested in indirect ways, in harsher treatment of others, in a general atmosphere of tension that settled over the plantation like a storm cloud. Eliza moved through this environment with heightened awareness, understanding that when power feels challenged, it often seeks the easiest target. She made herself neither prominent nor invisible, occupying the narrow space that had kept her alive before. Time passed, and with it came changes that no one could fully control. The wider world shifted in subtle ways, through laws debated far away, through conflicts that rippled along river routes and trade roads. Eliza heard fragments of these changes in conversations she was not meant to overhear, in the nervous tone of overseers, in the guarded optimism of those who dared to imagine an end to bondage. These rumors were dangerous to believe in, yet impossible to ignore. They formed a background hum beneath daily life, a reminder that systems, no matter how entrenched, were not eternal. Within this context, Eliza's unsold status took on new meaning. It was no longer just a personal anomaly, but part of a larger pattern of instability. The master, sensing this, grew increasingly anxious to resolve the problem she represented. He considered selling her quietly, far from the markets that had rejected her, but the logistics were complicated. Any transfer risked questions, any explanation risked exposure. The very secrecy he relied on now worked against him, because secrecy bred suspicion. Eliza understood that her fate hung in this uncertainty. She did not romanticize it. She knew that outcomes were rarely just, rarely kind. Yet she also knew that she had already survived something rare, a moment when the system hesitated, when ownership faltered under the weight of its own contradictions. That moment could not be undone. It lived on in memory, in rumor, in the subtle recalibrations of power she witnessed daily. As months turned into years, Eliza's name began to fade from official records. She was listed simply as labor, as inventory, as presence without story. This was deliberate. Records were tools of control, and omission was one of their sharpest edges. By removing her name, the master attempted to reclaim narrative authority, to reduce her again to an interchangeable body. Yet the people around her remembered. Names lived on in speech even when they disappeared from paper. Eliza became one of those remembered figures, spoken of carefully, as an example of something that had almost happened, something that had briefly cracked the surface of certainty. Eliza herself changed in ways that were not immediately visible. Experience deepened her awareness, sharpened her sense of timing and restraint. She learned when to listen and when to withdraw, when to speak quietly to the right person, and when to remain entirely silent. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as attentive. Attention, she had learned, was a form of survival. It allowed her to navigate shifting terrain without drawing unnecessary notice. The master's health declined over time, worn down by stress he refused to acknowledge. His authority, once unquestioned, became more fragmented, delegated to others who enforced rules without fully understanding them. This fragmentation created small gaps in control, moments of looseness that Eliza recognized and adapted to. She did not exploit them recklessly. She used them to preserve herself, to avoid danger, to remain intact. In a system designed to consume people, remaining intact was its own form of defiance. When the plantation eventually changed hands, as so many did, Eliza's story did not follow the usual path. She was transferred with little ceremony, her history summarized in vague terms that revealed nothing and explained even less. The question that had once followed her was not written down. It lived only in memory, and memory, though powerful, was uneven. Some remembered clearly, others chose to forget. Eliza entered this new chapter of her life, carrying both the burden and the protection of that incomplete remembrance. In this new place, she encountered people who had heard versions of her story and people who had heard nothing at all. She learned quickly who knew and who did not, adjusting her behavior accordingly. Her silence remained her shield, her awareness her guide. She understood that the world had not changed simply because it had hesitated once. Yet that hesitation had mattered. It had altered trajectories, including her own. in ways that could not be fully measured. As years passed, larger forces began to reshape the landscape around her. Conflict drew nearer. Authority shifted. The certainty that had once defined her captivity weakened under pressures far beyond her control. Eliza watched these changes with cautious attention, aware that history was moving, that systems were straining. She did not know what freedom would look like if it came, or whether she would recognize it when it did. She only knew that she had already lived through a moment when the system had failed to claim her, and that knowledge stayed with her like a quiet flame. When records later fell silent about her fate, historians would struggle to trace her path. There would be no definitive account of how her life ended or where it led. Yet absence did not mean insignificance. Eliza's story survived not in documents, but in the way it revealed the fragility of a system built on absolute control. She had not overthrown it. She had not escaped it dramatically. She had simply stood within it, silent and unyielding, long enough for its contradictions to surface. In that sense, Eliza became part of a hidden history, one composed not of grand victories, but of small disruptions, of moments when power faltered and humanity persisted. Her life, like so many others, resisted neat conclusion. It unfolded in the spaces between records, in the memories passed quietly from person to person. And in those spaces, her unsolved status remained what it had always been, a reminder that even the most brutal systems could be unsettled by a single unanswered question, and that sometimes survival itself was the most enduring form of resistance. The years that followed did not arrive with a single defining moment, no clear line where bondage ended and something else began, but rather with a slow unraveling that felt almost unreal to those living inside it. Eliza sensed the change before. She could name it, in the way conversations lowered when certain topics arose, in the way authority figures argued among themselves, in the way rules were enforced one day and ignored the next. The world that had once seemed immovable began to shift under its own weight, strained by forces larger than any one plantation, larger even than the markets that had once rejected her. She watched carefully, as she always had, understanding that transition was as dangerous as certainty, sometimes more so. When freedom finally arrived, whether suddenly through decree and occupation or gradually through collapse and abandonment, it did not feel like the triumphant release described in stories told later. It felt uncertain, fragile, incomplete. People who had lived their entire lives under command now faced a world that offered little guidance and less protection. Eliza stepped into this new reality, carrying no papers that proved who she was or what she had endured. Like so many others, she was free in name before she was free in practice. Yet even in that uncertainty, she carried something rare, experience navigating instability. She had lived through a moment when the system hesitated, when ownership failed to attach itself to her body, and that memory became a quiet guide as she learned how to move through a world still hostile to her existence. Freedom did not erase the past. It did not undo the years of silence, of vigilance, of careful self-containment. Eliza did not suddenly become loud or expressive. She did not tell her story openly. She understood that the world outside slavery still demanded restraint from people like her, that visibility could invite danger just as easily as invisibility. Yet she also understood that she no longer belonged to anyone else, and that knowledge, even when unspoken, changed the way she stood, the way she walked, the way she breathed. The stillness that had once been a shield remained, but it was no longer enforced. It was chosen. As time passed, Eliza's story did what so many stories like hers did. It fragmented. Some remembered her as the girl who could not be sold. Others remembered only the rumor, the unanswered question that had unsettled a market. Some remembered nothing at all. History, written by those who valued profit and power, left little space for her name. There were no detailed records of her later life, no official acknowledgement of what she had revealed simply by existing as she was. And yet, the absence of documentation did not mean the absence of impact. Her story survived in subtler ways, in the understanding passed between people who had witnessed the market's hesitation, in the knowledge that even the most brutal systems contain flaws. Eliza's life after bondage was likely ordinary in ways history rarely records. She worked, she aged, she carried memories she did not always share. Perhaps she formed family ties, chosen or biological. Perhaps she moved from place to place. following opportunity or safety. These details remain unknown, and perhaps that is fitting. Her significance was never meant to be captured neatly. It lived in the moment when the system failed to claim her, when buyers stepped back not out of mercy but out of fear, and in doing so revealed something essential about the nature of oppression. What Eliza's story shows us is not a tale of dramatic rebellion or overt resistance. It is a story of quiet endurance and unintended disruption. She did not set out to challenge slavery. She did not stand on the auction block and speak defiance. She simply existed in a way the system could not easily process. Her silence, shaped by survival, became a mirror reflecting the system's own contradictions. The buyer's question, asked again and again, was not about her humanity, but about their control. And when that control felt uncertain, the entire transaction collapsed. This is why her story matters now. It reminds us that power often depends on stories it tells itself. Stories about control, about superiority, about inevitability. When those stories are interrupted, even briefly, power wavers. Eliza interrupted the story without words. She exposed the fear at the heart of a system that pretended to be confident and absolute. She showed the domination was not just enforced through violence, but maintained through belief, and that belief could be shaken. Her life also reminds us how many stories have been lost, how many names erased, how many acts of quiet resistance went unrecognized because they did not fit the narratives history preferred to tell. Not every challenge to oppression looks like open revolt. Some look like stillness, some look like silence. Some look like a young girl standing in a marketplace unsold, while men with money in their hands hesitate because the truth makes them uncomfortable. Eliza did not win freedom for others in a single moment. She did not dismantle the system that oppressed her, but she revealed its weakness, however briefly, and that revelation mattered. It mattered to the buyers who walked away, to the master whose authority cracked, to the people who whispered her story afterward, and to us now, looking back and trying to understand how such a system could exist and how it eventually fell. History is not only shaped by those who shout the loudest, it is also shaped by those who endure, who survive, who force the world to pause and reckon with what it would rather ignore. Today, when we tell Eliza's story, we are not just recounting a tragedy from the past. We are honoring a form of resistance that has long been overlooked. We are acknowledging that silence, when chosen and sustained, can carry immense power. We are recognizing that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were moments when the machinery of oppression faltered, not because it was confronted head-on, but because it could not resolve the humanity it sought to erase. Eliza's name may not appear in textbooks. Her face may never be known, but her story survives because it reveals something true, that systems built on cruelty are never as stable as they appear, and that those they seek to dominate are never as powerless as they are made to seem. Her life stands as a quiet testament to the fact that survival itself can be a form of resistance, and that sometimes the most unsettling thing you can do to an unjust system is simply refuse to be easily consumed by it. And if this story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect on the lives history tried to bury, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss stories like this, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you. Because every time these stories are told, remembered, and shared, we reclaim a piece of history that was never meant to survive,